Chapter 9. Every week, there seems to be one invitation that is coveted above all others, and this week's prize must surely go to the Countess of Macclesfield, who is hosting a grand ball on Monday night. Lady Macclesfield is not a frequent hostess here in London, but she is very popular, as is her husband, and it is expected that a great many bachelors plan to attend, including Mr. Colin Bridgerton, assuming he does not collapse from exhaustion after 4 days with the 10 Bridgerton grandchildren, Viscount Berwick, and Mr. Michael Anstruther Weatherby. This author anticipates that a great many young and unmarried ladies will choose to attend as well, following the publication of this column. Lady Whistledown's Society Papers, April 16, 1824. His life as he knew it was over. What? He asked, aware that he was blinking rapidly. Her face turned a deeper shade of crimson than he'd thought humanly possible, and she turned away. Never mind, she mumbled. Forget I said anything. Colin thought that a very good idea. But then, just when he'd thought that his world might resume its normal course, or at least that he'd be able to pretend it had, she whirled back around, her eyes alight with a passionate fire that astonished him. No, I'm not going to forget it, she cried out. I've spent my life forgetting things, not saying them, never telling anyone what I really want. Colin tried to say something, but it was clear to him that his throat had begun to close. Any minute now he'd be dead. He was sure of it. It won't mean a thing, she said. I promise you, it won't mean anything, and I'd never expect anything from you because of it, but I could die tomorrow, Anne. What? Her eyes looked huge, and meltingly dark, and pleading, and he could feel his resolve melting away. I'm 28, she said, her voice soft and sad. I'm an old maid, and I've never been kissed. Gah, gah, gah. He knew how to speak, he was fairly certain he'd been perfectly articulate just minutes earlier. But now he didn't seem able to form a word. And Penelope kept talking, her cheeks delightfully pink, and her lips moving so quickly that he couldn't help but wonder what they'd feel like on his skin. On his neck, on his shoulder, on his other places. I'm going to be an old maid at 29, she said, and I'll be an old maid at 30. I could die tomorrow, Anne. You're not going to die tomorrow, he somehow managed to get out. But I could. I could, and it would kill me, because you'd already be dead, he said, thinking his voice sounded rather strange and disembodied. I don't want to die without ever having been kissed, she finally finished. Colin could think of 100 reasons why kissing Penelope Featherington was a very bad idea, the number one being that he actually wanted to kiss her. He opened his mouth, hoping that a sound would emerge and that it might actually be intelligible speech, but there was nothing, just the sound of breath on his lips. And then Penelope did the one thing that could break his resolve in an instant. She looked up at him, deeply into his eyes, and uttered one simple word. Please. He was lost. There was something heartbreaking in the way she was gazing at him, as if she might die if he didn't kiss her. Not from heartbreak, not from embarrassment, it was almost as if she needed him for nourishment, to feed her soul, to fill her heart. And Colin couldn't remember anyone else ever needing him with such fervor. It humbled him. It made him want her with an intensity that nearly buckled his knees. He looked at her, and somehow he didn't see the woman he'd seen so many times before. She was different. She glowed. She was a siren, a goddess, and he wondered how on earth no one had ever noticed this before. Colin, she whispered. He took a step forward, barely a half a foot, but it was close enough so that when he touched her chin and tipped her face up, her lips were mere inches from his. Their breath mingled, and the air grew hot and heavy. Penelope was trembling, he could feel that under his fingers, but he wasn't so sure that he wasn't trembling, too. He assumed he'd say something flip and droll, like the devil-may-care fellow he was reputed to be. Anything for you, perhaps, or maybe, every woman deserves at least one kiss. But as he closed the bare distance between them, he realized that there were no words that could capture the intensity of the moment. No words for the passion. No words for the need. No words for the sheer epiphany of the moment. And so, on an otherwise unremarkable Friday afternoon, in the heart of Mayfair, in a quiet drawing room on Mount Street, Colin Bridgerton kissed Penelope Featherington. And it was glorious. His lips touched hers softly at first, not because he was trying to be gentle, although if he'd had the presence of mind to think about such things, it probably would have occurred to him that this was her first kiss, and it ought to be reverent and beautiful and all the things a girl dreams about as she's lying in bed at night. But in all truth, none of that was on Colin's mind. In fact, he was thinking of quite little. His kiss was soft and gentle, because he was still so surprised that he was kissing her. He'd known her for years, had never even thought about touching his lips to hers. And now he couldn't have let her go if the fires of hell were licking his toes. He could barely believe what he was doing, or that he wanted to do it so damned much. It wasn't the sort of a kiss one initiates because one is overcome with passion or emotion or anger or desire. It was a slower thing, a learning experience, for Colin just as much as for Penelope. And he was learning that everything he thought he'd known about kissing was rubbish. Everything else had been mere lips and tongue and softly murmured but meaningless words. This was a kiss. There was something in the friction, the way he could hear and feel her breath at the same time, something in the way she held perfectly still, and yet he could feel her heart pounding through her skin. There was something in the fact that he knew it was her. Colin moved his lips slightly to the left, until he was nipping the corner of her mouth, softly tickling the very spot where her lips joined. His tongue dipped and traced, learning the contours of her mouth, tasting the sweet salty essence of her. This was more than a kiss. His hands, which had been lightly splayed against her back, grew rigid, more tense as they pressed into the fabric of her dress. He could feel the heat of her under his fingertips, seeping up through the muslin, swirling in the delicate muscles of her back. He drew her to him, pulling her closer, closer, until their bodies were pressed together. He could feel her, the entire length of her, and it set him on fire. He was growing hard, and he wanted her, dear God, how he wanted her. His mouth grew more insistent, and his tongue darted forward, nudging her until her lips parted. He swallowed her soft moan of acquiescence, then pushed forward to taste her. She was sweet and a little tart from the lemonade, and she was clearly as intoxicating as fine brandy, because Colin was starting to doubt his ability to remain on his feet. He moved his hands along the length of her, slowly, so as not to frighten her. She was soft, curvy, and lush, just as he'd always thought a woman should be. Her hips flared, and her bottom was perfect, and her breasts, good God, her breasts felt good pressing against his chest. His palms itched to cup them, but he forced his hands to remain where they were, rather enjoyably on her derriere, so it really wasn't that much of a sacrifice, beside the fact that he really shouldn't be groping a gently bred lady's breasts in the middle of her drawing room. He had a rather painful suspicion that if he touched her in that way, he would lose himself completely. Penelope, Penelope, he murmured, wondering why her name tasted so good on his lips. He was ravenous for her, heady and drugged by passion, and he wanted desperately for her to feel the same way. She felt perfect in his arms, but thus far, she had made no reaction. Oh, she had swayed in his arms and opened her mouth to welcome his sweet invasion, but other than that, she had done nothing. And yet, from the pant of her breath and the beat of her heart, he knew that she was aroused. He pulled back, just a few inches so that he could touch her chin and tilt her face up toward his. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that were dazed with passion, perfectly matching her lips, which were lightly parted, completely soft, and thoroughly swollen from his kisses. She was beautiful. Utterly, completely, soul-stirringly beautiful. He didn't know how he hadn't noticed it all these years. Was the world populated with blind men, or merely stupid ones? "You can kiss me, too," he whispered, leaning his forehead lightly against hers. She did nothing but blink. "A kiss," he murmured, lowering his lips to hers again, although just for a fleeting moment, "is for two people." Her hand stirred at his back. "What do I do?" she whispered. "Whatever you want to do." Slowly, tentatively, she lifted one of her hands to his face. Her fingers trailed lightly over his cheek, skimming along the line of his jaw until they fell away. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you?" He went still. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. He didn't want to be thanked for his kiss. It made him feel guilty. And shallow. As if it had been something done out of pity. And the worst part was he knew that if all this had come to pass only a few months earlier, it would have been out of pity. What the hell did that say about him? "Don't thank me," he said gruffly, shoving himself backward until they were no longer touching. "But, I said don't," he repeated harshly, turning away as if he couldn't bear the sight of her, when the truth was that he couldn't quite bear himself. And the damnedest thing was, he wasn't sure why. This desperate, gnawing feeling, was it guilt? Because he shouldn't have kissed her? Because he shouldn't have liked it? "Colin," she said, "don't be angry with yourself." "I'm not," he snapped. "I asked you to kiss me. I practically forced you." Now, there was a surefire way to make a man feel manly. "You didn't force me," he bit off. "No, but—" "For the love of God, Penelope, enough." She drew back, her eyes wide. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He looked down at her hands. They were shaking. He closed his eyes in agony. Why was he being such an ass? "Penelope," he began. "No, it's all right," she said, her words rushed. "You don't have to say anything." "No, I should. I really wish you wouldn't." And now she looked so quietly dignified. Which made him feel even worse. She was standing there, her hands clasped demurely in front of her, her eyes downward, not quite on the floor, but not on his face. She thought he'd kissed her out of pity. And he was a knave, because a small part of him wanted her to think that. Because if she thought it, then maybe he could convince himself that it was true, that it was just pity, that it couldn't possibly be more. "I should go," he said, the words quiet, and yet still too loud in the silent room. She didn't try to stop him. He motioned to the door. "I should go," he said again, even as his feet refused to move. She nodded. "I didn't," he started to say, and then, horrified by the words that had nearly come out of his mouth, he actually did head toward the door. But Penelope called out, of course she called out, "You didn't what?" And he didn't know what to say, because what he'd started to say was, "I didn't kiss you out of pity." If he wanted her to know that, if he wanted to convince himself of that, then that could only mean that he craved her good opinion, which could only mean. "I have to go," he blurted out, desperate now, as if leaving the room might be the only way to keep his thoughts from traveling down such a dangerous road. He crossed the remaining distance to the door, waiting for her to say something, to call out his name. But she didn't. And he left. And he'd never hated himself more. Colin was in an exceedingly bad mood before the footman showed up at his front door with a summons from his mother. Afterward, he was beyond repair. Bloody hell. She was going to start in on him again about getting married. Her summonses were always about getting married. And he really wasn't in the mood for it right now. But she was his mother. And he loved her. And that meant he couldn't very well ignore her. So with considerable grumbling and a fair bit of cursing while he was at it, he yanked on his boots and coat, and headed out the door. He was living in Bloomsbury, not the most fashionable section of town for a member of the aristocracy, although Bedford Square, where he had taken out a lease on a small but elegant terrace house, was certainly an upscale and respectable address. Colin rather liked living in Bloomsbury, where his neighbors were doctors and lawyers and scholars and people who actually did things other than attend party after party. He wasn't ready to trade in his heritage for a life and trade. It was rather good to be a Bridgerton, after all, but there was something stimulating about watching professional men going about their daily business, the lawyers heading east to the Inns of the Court, the doctors northwest to Portland Place. It would have been easy enough to drive his cuckle across town. It had only been brought back to the Mews an hour ago upon his return from the Featheringtons. But Colin was feeling a bit in need of some fresh air, not to mention perverse enough to take the slowest means possible to number 5. If his mother intended to deliver another lecture on the virtues of marriage, followed by a lengthy dissertation on the attributes of each and every eligible miss in London, she could bloody well wait for him. Colin closed his eyes and groaned. His mood must be worse than even he had thought if he was cursing in relation to his mother, whom he, and all the Bridgertons, really, held in the highest esteem and affection. It was Penelope's fault. No, it was Eloise's fault, he thought, grinding his teeth. Better to blame a sibling. No, he slumped back into his desk chair, groaning, it was his fault. If he was in a bad mood, if he was ready to yank someone's head off with his bare hands, it was his fault and his fault alone. He shouldn't have kissed Penelope. It didn't matter that he'd wanted to kiss her, even though he hadn't even realized that he wanted to until right before she'd mentioned it. He still shouldn't have kissed her. Although, when he really thought about it, he wasn't quite sure why he shouldn't have kissed her. He stood, then trudged to the window and let his forehead rest against the pane. Bedford Square was quiet, with only a few men walking along the pavement. Laborers, they looked to be, probably working on the new museum being built just to the east. It was why Colin had taken a house on the west side of the square, the construction could get very noisy. His gaze traveled north, to the statue of Charles James Fox. Now, there was a man with a purpose. Led the Whigs for years. He hadn't always been very well liked, if some of the older members of the Ton were to be believed, but Colin was coming to think that perhaps being well liked was overrated. Heaven knew that no one was better liked than he was, and look at him now, frustrated and malcontent, grumpy and ready to lash out at anyone who crossed his path. He sighed, planting one hand on the window frame and pushing himself back to an upright position. He'd better get going, especially if he was planning to walk all the way to Mayfair. Although, in truth, it really wasn't that far. Probably not more than 30 minutes if he kept his pace brisk, and he always did, less if the pavements weren't littered with slow people. It was longer than most members of the Ton cared to be outside in London unless they were shopping or fashionably strolling in the park, but Colin felt the need to clear his head. And if the air in London wasn't particularly fresh, well, it would still have to do. His luck that day being what it was, however, by the time he reached the intersection of Oxford and Regent Streets, the first splats of raindrops began to dance against his face. By the time he was turning off Hanover Square onto St. George Street, it was pouring in earnest. And he was just close enough to Bruton Street that it would have been really ridiculous to have tried to hail a hackney to take him the rest of the way. So he walked on. After the first minute or so of annoyance, however, the rain began to feel oddly good. It was warm enough out that it didn't chill him to the bone, and the fat, wet sting of it almost felt like a penance. And he felt like maybe that was what he deserved. The door to his mother's house opened before Colin's foot had even found the top step. Wickham must have been waiting for him. "Might I suggest a towel?" the butler intoned, handing him a large white cloth. Colin took it, wondering how on earth Wickham had had time to get a towel. He couldn't have known that Colin would be fool enough to walk in the rain. Not for the first time it occurred to Colin that butlers must be possessed of strange, mystical powers. Perhaps it was a job requirement. Colin used the towel to dry his hair, causing great consternation to Wickham, who was terribly proper and surely expected Colin to retire to a private room for at least a half an hour to mend his appearance. "Where's my mother?" Colin asked. Wickham's lips tightened, and he looked pointedly down at Colin's feet, which were now creating small puddles. "She is in her office," he replied, "but she is speaking with your sister." "Which sister?" Colin asked, keeping a sunny smile on his face, just to annoy Wickham, who had surely been trying to annoy him by omitting his sister's name. As if you could simply say, "your sister," to a Bridgerton and expect him to know who you were talking about. "Francesca." "Ah, yes. She's returning to Scotland soon, isn't she?" "Tomorrow." Colin handed the towel back to Wickham, who regarded it as he might a large insect. "I won't bother her, then. Just let her know I'm here when she's done with Francesca." Wickham nodded. "Would you care to change your clothes, Mr. Bridgerton?" I believe we have some of your brother Gregory's garments upstairs in his bedchamber. Colin found himself smiling. Gregory was finishing up his final term at Cambridge. He was 11 years younger than Colin, and it was difficult to believe they could actually share clothing, but he supposed it was time to accept that his little brother had finally grown up. That's an excellent idea, Colin said. He gave his sodden sleeve a rueful glance. I'll leave these here to be cleaned and fetch them later. Wickham nodded again, murmured, as you wish, and disappeared down the hall to parts unknown. Colin took the steps 2 at a time up to the family quarters. As he sloshed down the hall, he heard the sound of a door opening. Turning around, he saw that it was Eloise. Not the person he wanted to see, she immediately brought back all the memories of his afternoon with Penelope. Their conversation. The kiss. Especially the kiss. And even worse, the guilt he'd felt afterward. The guilt he still felt. Colin, Eloise said brightly, I didn't realize you, what did you do, walk? He shrugged. I like the rain. She eyed him curiously, her head cocking to the side as it always did when she was puzzling through something. You're in a rather odd mood today. I'm soaking wet, Eloise. No need to snap at me about it, she said with a sniff. I didn't force you to walk across town in the rain. It wasn't raining when I left, he felt rather compelled to say. There was something about a sibling that brought out the 8-year-old in a body. I'm sure the sky was gray, she returned. Clearly, she had a bit of the 8-year-old in her as well. May we continue this discussion when I'm dry, he asked, his voice deliberately impatient. Of course, she said expansively, all accommodation. I'll wait for you right here. Colin took his time while he changed into Gregory's clothes, taking more care with his cravat than he had in years. Finally, when he was convinced that Eloise must be grinding her teeth, he re-entered the hall. I heard you went to see Penelope today, she said without preamble. Wrong thing to say. Where did you hear that? He asked carefully. He knew that his sister and Penelope were close, but surely Penelope wouldn't have told Eloise about that. Felicity told Hyacinth. And Hyacinth told you. Of course. Something, Colin muttered, has got to be done about all the gossip in this town. I hardly think this counts as gossip, Colin, Eloise said. It's not as if you're interested in Penelope. If she had been talking about any other woman, Colin would have expected her to give him a sidelong glance, followed by a coy, are you? But this was Penelope, and even though Eloise was her very best friend, and thus her finest champion, even she couldn't imagine that a man of Colin's reputation and popularity would be interested in a woman of Penelope's reputation and, lack of, popularity. Colin's mood shifted from bad to foul. Anyway, Eloise continued, completely oblivious to the thunderstorm that was brewing in her normally sunny and jovial brother, Felicity told Hyacinth that Brierly told her that you'd visited. I was just wondering what it was about. It's none of your business, Colin said briskly, hoping she'd leave it at that, but not really believing she would. He took a step toward the stairwell, though, always optimistic. It's about my birthday, isn't it? Eloise gasped, dashing in front of him with such suddenness that his toe crashed into her slipper. She winced but Colin didn't feel particularly sympathetic. No, it's not about your birthday, he snapped. Your birthday isn't even until. He stopped. Ah, hell. Until next week, he grumbled. She smiled slyly. Then, as if her brain had just realized it had taken a wrong turn, her lips parted with dismay as she mentally backed up and headed in another direction. So, she continued, moving slightly so that she better blocked his path, if you didn't go over there to discuss my birthday, and there's nothing you could say now that would convince me you did, why? Did you go see Penelope? Is nothing private in this world? Not in this family. Colin decided that his best bet was to adopt his usual sunny persona, even though he didn't feel the least bit charitable toward her at the moment, and so he slapped on the smoothest and easiest of his smiles, quirked his head to the side, and asked, Do I hear Mother calling my name? I didn't hear a thing, Eloise said pertly, and what is wrong with you? You look very odd. I'm fine. You're not fine. You look as if you've been to the dentist. His voice descended into a mutter. It's always nice to receive compliments from family. If you can't trust your family to be honest with you, she volleyed, who can you trust? He leaned fluidly back against the wall, crossing his arms. I prefer flattery to honesty. No, you don't. Dear God, he wanted to smack her. He hadn't done that since he was 12. And he'd been horsewhipped for it. The only time he could recall his father laying a hand on him. What I want, Colin returned, arching one brow, is an immediate cessation of this conversation. What you want, Eloise needled, is for me to stop asking you why you went to see Penelope Featherington, but I think we both know that isn't likely to occur. And that was when he knew it. Knew it deep in his bones, from his head to his toes, his heart to his mind, that his sister was Lady Whistledown. All of the pieces fit. There was no one more stubborn and bull-headed, no one who could, or would, take the time to get to the bottom of every last piece of gossip and innuendo. When Eloise wanted something, she didn't stop until she had it firmly in her grasp. It wasn't about money, or greed, or material goods. With her it was about knowledge. She liked knowing things, and she'd needle and needle and needle until you'd told her exactly what she wanted to hear. It was a miracle no one had found her out sooner. Out of nowhere he said, I need to talk to you. He grabbed her arm and hauled her into the nearest room, which happened to be her own. Colin, she shrieked, trying unsuccessfully to shake him off. What are you doing? He slammed the door shut, let go of her, and crossed his arms, his stance wide, his expression menacing. Colin, she repeated, her voice dubious. I know what you've been up to. What I've been. And then, damn her, she started laughing. Eloise, he boomed. I'm talking to you. Clearly, she just barely managed to get out. He held his ground, glaring at her. She was looking away, nearly doubled over with laughter. Finally, she said, what are you? But then she looked at him again, and even though she'd tried to keep her mouth shut, she exploded again. If she'd been drinking something, Colin thought without a trace of humor, it would have come out her nose. What the hell is the matter with you? He snapped. That finally got her attention. He didn't know whether it was his tone of voice or maybe his use of profanity, but she sobered in an instant. My word, she said softly, you're serious. Do I look like I'm joking? No, Eloise said. Although you did at first. I'm sorry, Colin, but it's just not like you to be glowering and yelling and all that. You looked rather like Anthony. You. Actually, she said, giving him a look that was not nearly as wary as it should have been, you looked more like yourself, trying to imitate Anthony. He was going to kill her. Right here in her room, in his mother's house, he was going to commit sororicide. Colin, she asked hesitantly, as if she'd just finally noticed that he had long since passed angry on his way to furious. Sit down. He jerked his head toward a chair. Now. Are you all right? Sit down, he roared. And she did. With alacrity. I can't remember the last time you raised your voice, she whispered. I can't remember the last time I had cause to. What's wrong? He decided he might as well just come out and say it. Colin? I know you're Lady Whistledown. Way out? There's no use denying it. I've seen. Eloise jumped to her feet. Except that it's not true. Suddenly he no longer felt quite so angry. Instead he felt tired, old. Eloise, I've seen the proof. What proof? She asked, her voice rising with disbelief. How can there be proof of something that isn't true? He grabbed one of her hands. Look at your fingers. She did so. What about them? Ink stains. Her mouth fell open. From that you've deduced that I'm Lady Whistledown? Why are they there, then? You've never used a quill? Eloise. There was a great deal of warning in his voice. I don't have to tell you why I have ink stains on my fingers. He said her name again, I don't, she protested. I owe you no. Oh, very well, fine. She crossed her arms mutinously. I write letters. He shot her an extremely disbelieving look. I do, she protested. Every day. Sometimes 2 in a day when Francesca is away. I'm quite a loyal correspondent. You should know. I've written enough letters with your name on the envelope, although I doubt half of them ever reached you. Letters? He asked, his voice full of doubt and derision. For God's sake, Eloise, do you really think that will wash? Who? The devil are you writing so many letters to? She blushed. Really, truly, deeply blushed. It's none of your business. He would have been intrigued by her reaction if he still weren't so sure that she was lying about being Lady Whistledown. For God's sake, Eloise, he bit off. Who is going to believe that you're writing letters every day? I certainly don't. She glared at him, her dark gray eyes flashing with fury. I don't care what you think, she said in a very low voice. No, that's not true. I am furious that you don't believe me. You're not giving me much to believe in, he said wearily. She stood, walked over to him, and poked him in the chest. Hard. You are my brother, she spat out. You should believe me unquestioningly. Love me unconditionally. That's what it means to be family. Eloise, he said, her name coming out really is nothing more than a sigh. Don't try to make excuses now. I wasn't. That's even worse. She stalked to the door. You should be on your hands and knees, begging me for forgiveness. He hadn't thought he had it in him to smile, but somehow that did it for him. Now, that doesn't really seem in keeping with my character, does it? She opened her mouth to say something, but the sound that came out was not precisely English. All she managed was something along the lines of, "Ooh-hoo," in an extremely irate voice, and then she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Colin slouched into a chair, wondering when she'd realize that she'd left him in her own bedchamber. The irony was, he reflected, possibly the only bright spot in an otherwise miserable day. Chapter 10. Dear reader. It is with a surprisingly sentimental heart that I write these words. After 11 years of chronicling the lives and times of the beau monde, this author is putting down her pen. Although Lady Danbury's challenge was surely the catalyst for the retirement, in truth the blame cannot be placed entirely upon that countess's shoulders. The column has grown wearisome of late, less fulfilling to write, and perhaps less entertaining to read. This author needs a change. It is not so difficult to fathom. 11 years is a long time. And in truth, the recent renewal of interest in this author's identity has grown disturbing. Friends are turning against friends, brothers against sisters, all in the futile attempt to solve an unsolvable secret. Furthermore, the sleuthing of the ton has grown downright dangerous. Last week it was Lady Blackwood's twisted ankle. This week's injury apparently belongs to Hyacinth Bridgerton, who was slightly hurt at Saturday's soiree held at the London home of Lord and Lady Riverdale. It has not escaped this author's notice that Lord Riverdale is Lady Danbury's nephew. Miss Hyacinth must have suspected someone in attendance, because she sustained her injuries while falling into the library after the door was opened while she had her ear pressed up to the wood. Listening at doors, chasing down delivery boys, and these are only the tidbits that have reached this author's ears. What has London society come to? This author assures you, dear reader, that she never once listened at a door in all 11 years of her career. All gossip in this column was come by fairly, with no tools or tricks, other than keen eyes and ears. I bid you au revoir, London. It has been a pleasure to serve you. Lady Whistledown Society Papers, April 19, 1824. It was, not surprisingly, the talk of the Macclesfield ball. Lady Whistledown has retired. Can you believe it? What will I read with my breakfast? How will I know what happened if I miss a party? We'll never find out who she is now. Lady Whistledown has retired. One woman fainted, nearly cracking her head against the side of a table as she slumped gracelessly to the floor. Apparently, she had not read that morning's column and thus heard the news for the first time right there at the Macclesfield ball. She was revived by smelling salts, but then quickly swooned again. "She's a faker," Hyacinth Bridgerton muttered to Felicity Featherington as they stood in a small group with the Dowager Lady Bridgerton and Penelope. Penelope was officially attending as Felicity's chaperone due to their mother's decision to remain home with an upset stomach. "The first faint was real," Hyacinth explained. "Anyone could tell that by the clumsy way she fell, but this—" Her hand flicked toward the lady on the floor with a gesture of disgust. "No one swoons like a ballet dancer. Not even ballet dancers." Penelope had overheard the entire conversation, as Hyacinth was directly to her left, and so she murmured, "Have you ever swooned?" all the while keeping her eyes on the unfortunate woman, who was now coming awake with a delicate fluttering of eyelashes as the smelling salts were once again wafted under her nose. "Absolutely not," Hyacinth replied, with no small measure of pride. "Swoons are for the tender-hearted and foolish," she added. And if Lady Whistledown were still writing, mark my words, she would say the exact same thing in her next column. "Alas, there are no words to mark any more," Felicity answered with a sad sigh. Lady Bridgerton agreed. "It's the end of an era," she said. "I feel quite bereft without her." "Well, it's not as if we've had to go more than 18 hours without her yet," Penelope felt compelled to point out. "We did receive a column this morning." "What is there yet to feel bereft about?" "It's the principle of it," Lady Bridgerton said with a sigh. "If this were an ordinary Monday, I would know that I'd receive a new report on Wednesday. But now—" Felicity actually sniffled. "Now we're lost," she said. Penelope turned to her sister in disbelief. "Surely you're being a little melodramatic." Felicity's overblown shrug was worthy of the stage. Am I? Am I?" Hyacinth gave her a sympathetic pat on the back. "I don't think you are, Felicity. I feel precisely the same way." "It's only a gossip column," Penelope said, looking around for any sign of sanity in her companions. Surely they realized that the world was not drawing to a close just because Lady Whistledown had decided to end her career. "You're right, of course," said Lady Bridgerton, jutting her chin out and pursing her lips in a manner that was probably supposed to convey an air of practicality. "Thank you for being the voice of reason for our little party." But then she seemed to deflate slightly, and she said, "But I must admit, I'd grown rather used to having her around." "Whoever she is." Penelope decided it was well past time to change the topic. "Where is Eloise this evening?" "Ill, I'm afraid." "A headache," Lady Bridgerton said, small frowns of worry creasing her otherwise unlined face. "She hasn't been feeling the thing for almost a week now. I'm starting to grow concerned about her." Penelope had been staring rather aimlessly at a sconce on the wall, but her attention was immediately brought back to Lady Bridgerton. "It's nothing serious, I hope?" "It's nothing serious," Hyacinth answered, before her mother could even open her mouth. "Eloise never gets sick." "Which is precisely why I'm worried," Lady Bridgerton said. "She hasn't been eating very well." "That's not true," Hyacinth said. "Just this afternoon Wickham brought up a very heavy tray. Scones and eggs, and I think I smelled gammon steak." She gave an arch look to no one in particular. And when Eloise left the tray out in the hall it was completely empty. Hyacinth Bridgerton, Penelope decided, had a surprisingly good eye for detail. "She's been in a bad mood," Hyacinth continued, "since she quarreled with Colin." "She quarreled with Colin?" Penelope asked, an awful feeling beginning to roil her stomach. "When?" "Sometime last week," Hyacinth said. "When?" Penelope wanted to scream, but surely it would look odd if she demanded an exact day. "Was it Friday?" "Was it?" Penelope would always remember that her first, and most probably only, kiss had occurred on a Friday. She was strange that way. She always remembered the days of the week. She'd met Colin on a Monday. She'd kissed him on a Friday. 12 years later. She sighed. It seemed fairly pathetic. "Is something wrong, Penelope?" Lady Bridgerton asked. Penelope looked at Eloise's mother. Her blue eyes were kind and filled with concern, and there was something about the way she tilted her head to the side that made Penelope want to cry. She was getting far too emotional these days. Crying over the tilt of a head. "I'm fine," she said, hoping that her smile looked true. "I'm just worried about Eloise." Hyacinth snorted. Penelope decided she needed to make her escape. All these Bridgertons, well, two of them, anyway, were making her think of Colin, which wasn't anything she hadn't been doing nearly every minute of the day for the past 3 days. But at least that had been in private, where she could sigh and moan and grumble to her heart's content. But this must have been her lucky night, because just then she heard Lady Danbury barking her name. What was her world coming to, that she considered herself lucky to be trapped in a corner with London's most acerbic tongue? But Lady Danbury would provide the perfect excuse to leave her current little quartet of ladies, and besides, she was coming to realize that in a very odd way she rather liked Lady Danbury. "Miss Featherington! Miss Featherington!" Felicity instantly took a step away. "I think she means you," she whispered urgently. "Of course she means me," Penelope said, with just a touch of hauteur. "I consider Lady Danbury a cherished friend." Felicity's eyes bugged out. "You do? Miss Featherington?" Lady Danbury said, thumping her cane an inch away from Penelope's foot as soon as she reached her side. "Not you," she said to Felicity, even though Felicity had done nothing more than smile politely as the Countess had approached. "You," she said to Penelope. Good evening, Lady Danbury," Penelope said, which she considered an admirable number of words under the circumstances. "I have been looking for you all evening," Lady D announced. Penelope found that a trifle surprising. "You have?" "Yes. I want to talk with you about that Whistledown woman's last column." "Me?" "Yes, you," Lady Danbury grumbled. "I'd be happy to talk with someone else if you could find me a body with more than half a brain." Penelope choked on the beginnings of laughter as she motioned to her companions. I assure you that Lady Bridgerton." Lady Bridgerton was furiously shaking her head. "She's too busy trying to get that oversized brood of hers married off," Lady Danbury announced. "Can't be expected to know how to conduct a decent conversation these days." Penelope stole a frantic glance over at Lady Bridgerton to see if she was upset by the insult. After all, she had been trying to marry off her oversized brood for a decade now. But Lady Bridgerton didn't look the least bit upset. In fact, she appeared to be stifling laughter. Stifling laughter and inching away, taking Hyacinth and Felicity with her. Sneaky little traitors. Ah, well, Penelope shouldn't complain. She'd wanted an escape from the Bridgertons, hadn't she? But she didn't particularly enjoy having Felicity and Hyacinth think they'd somehow pulled one over on her. "They're gone now," Lady Danbury cackled, "and a good thing it is, too. Those two gels haven't an intelligent thing to say between them." "Oh, now, that isn't true," Penelope felt compelled to protest. "Felicity and Hyacinth are both very bright." "I never said they weren't smart," Lady D replied acidly, "just that they haven't an intelligent thing to say. But don't worry," she added, giving Penelope a reassuring? Whoever heard of Lady Danbury being reassuring? Pat on the arm. "It's not their fault that their conversation is useless. They'll grow out of it. People are like fine wines. If they start off good, they only get better with age." Penelope had actually been glancing slightly to the right of Lady Danbury's face, peering over her shoulder at a man who she thought might be Colin, but wasn't. But this brought her attention right back to where the Countess wanted it. "Fine wines?" Penelope echoed. "Oomph. And here I thought you weren't listening." "No, of course I was listening." Penelope felt her lips tugging into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I was just distracted. Looking for that Bridgerton boy, no doubt." Penelope gasped. "Oh, don't look so shocked. It's written all over your face." I'm just surprised he hasn't noticed. I imagine he has, Penelope mumbled. Has he? Oomph. Lady Danbury frowned, the corners of her mouth spilling into long vertical wrinkles on either side of her chin. Doesn't speak well of him that he hasn't done anything about it. Penelope's heart ached. There was something oddly sweet about the old lady's faith in her, as if men like Colin fell in love with women like Penelope on a regular basis. Penelope had had to beg him to kiss her, for heaven's sake. And look how that had ended up. He'd left the house in a fit of temper and they hadn't spoken for 3 days. Well, don't worry over him, Lady Danbury said quite suddenly. We'll find you someone else. Penelope delicately cleared her throat. Lady Danbury, have you made me your project? The old lady beamed, her smile a bright and glowing streak in her wrinkled face. Of course. I'm surprised it has taken you so long to figure it out. But why? Penelope asked, truly unable to fathom it. Lady Danbury sighed. The sound wasn't sad, more wistful, really. Would you mind if we sat down for a spell? These old bones aren't what they used to be. Of course, Penelope said quickly, feeling terrible that she'd never once considered Lady Danbury's age as they stood there in the stuffy ballroom. But the Countess was so vibrant, it was difficult to imagine her ailing or weak. Here we are, Penelope said, taking her arm and leading her to a nearby chair. Once Lady Danbury was settled, Penelope took a seat beside her. Are you more comfortable now? Would you like something to drink? Lady Danbury nodded gratefully, and Penelope signaled to a footman to bring them 2 glasses of lemonade, since she didn't want to leave the Countess while she was looking so pale. I'm not as young as I used to be, Lady Danbury told her once the footman had hied off to the refreshment table. None of us are, Penelope replied. It could have been a flip comment, but it was spoken with wry warmth, and somehow Penelope thought that Lady Danbury would appreciate the sentiment. She was right. Lady D chuckled and sent Penelope an appreciative glance before saying, the older I get, the more I realize that most of the people in this world are fools. You're only just figuring that out now? Penelope asked, not to mock, but rather because, given Lady Danbury's usual demeanor, it was difficult to believe that she hadn't reached that conclusion years ago. Lady Danbury laughed heartily. No, sometimes I think I knew that before I was born. What I'm realizing now is that it's time I did something about it. What do you mean? I couldn't care less what happens to the fools of this world, but the people like you, lacking a handkerchief, she dabbed at her eyes with her fingers, well, I'd like to see you settled. For several seconds, Penelope did nothing but stare at her. Lady Danbury, she said carefully, I very much appreciate the gesture, and the sentiment, but you must know that I am not your responsibility. Of course I know that, Lady Danbury scoffed. Have no fear, I feel no responsibility to you. If I did, this wouldn't be half so much fun. Penelope knew she sounded the veriest ninny, but all she could think to say was, I don't understand. Lady Danbury held silent while the footmen returned with their lemonade, then began speaking once she had taken several small sips. I like you, Miss Featherington. I don't like a lot of people. It's as simple as that. And I want to see you happy. But I am happy, Penelope said, more out of reflex than anything else. Lady Danbury raised one arrogant brow, an expression that she did to perfection. Are you? She murmured. Was she? What did it mean that she had to stop and think about the answer? She wasn't unhappy, of that she was sure. She had wonderful friends, a true confidant in her younger sister, Felicity, and if her mother and older sisters weren't women she'd have chosen as close friends, well, she still loved them. And she knew they loved her. Hers wasn't such a bad lot. Her life lacked drama and excitement, but she was content. But contentment wasn't the same thing as happiness, and she felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest as she realized that she could not answer Lady Danbury's softly worded question in the affirmative. I've raised my family, Lady Danbury said. 4 children, and they all married well. I even found a bride for my nephew, who, truth be told, she leaned in and whispered the last 3 words, giving Penelope the impression that she was about to divulge a state secret I like better than my own children. Penelope couldn't help but smile. Lady Danbury looked so furtive, so naughty. It was rather cute, actually. It may surprise you, Lady Danbury continued, but by nature I'm a bit of a meddler. Penelope kept her expression scrupulously even. I find myself at loose ends, Lady Danbury said, holding up her hands as if in surrender. I'd like to see one last person happily settled before I go. Don't talk that way, Lady Danbury, Penelope said, impulsively reaching out and taking her hand. She gave it a little squeeze. You'll outlive us all, I am certain. Pfft, don't be silly. Lady Danbury's tone was dismissive, but she made no move to remove her hand from Penelope's grasp. I'm not being depressed, she added. I'm just realistic. I passed 70 years of age, and I'm not going to tell you how many years ago that was. I haven't much time left in this world, and that doesn't bother me one bit. Penelope hoped she would be able to face her own mortality with the same equanimity. But I like you, Miss Featherington. You remind me of myself. You're not afraid to speak your mind. Penelope could only look at her in shock. She'd spent the last 10 years of her life never quite saying what she wanted to say. With people she knew well she was open and honest and even sometimes a little funny, but among strangers her tongue was quite firmly tied. She remembered a masquerade ball she'd once attended. She'd attended many masquerade balls, actually, but this one had been unique because she'd actually found a costume, nothing special, just a gown styled as if from the 1600s, in which she'd truly felt her identity was hidden. It had probably been the mask. It was overly large and covered almost all of her face. She had felt transformed. Suddenly free of the burden of being Penelope Featherington, she felt a new personality coming to the fore. It wasn't as if she had been putting on false airs, rather, it was more like her true self, the one she didn't know how to show to anyone she didn't know well, had finally broken loose. She'd laughed, she'd joked. She'd even flirted. And she'd sworn that the following night, when the costumes were all put away and she was once again attired in her finest evening dress, she'd remember how to be herself. But it hadn't happened. She'd arrived at the ball and she'd nodded and smiled politely and once again found herself standing near the perimeter of the room, quite literally a wallflower. It seemed that being Penelope Featherington meant something. Her lot had been cast years ago. During that first awful season when her mother had insisted she make her debut even though Penelope had begged otherwise. The pudgy girl. The awkward girl. The one always dressed in colors that didn't suit her. It didn't matter that she'd slimmed and grown graceful and finally thrown out all of her yellow dresses. In this world, the world of London society and the ton, she would always be the same old Penelope Featherington. It was her own fault just as much as anyone else's. A vicious circle, really. Every time Penelope stepped into a ballroom, and she saw all those people who had known her for so long, she felt herself folding up inside, turning into the shy, awkward girl of years gone past, rather than the self-assured woman she liked to think she'd become, at least in her heart. Miss Featherington, came Lady Danbury's soft, and surprisingly gentle, voice. Is something wrong? Penelope knew she took longer than she should have to reply, but somehow she needed a few seconds to find her voice. I don't think I know how to speak my mind, she finally said, turning to look at Lady Danbury only as she uttered the final words of the sentence. I never know what to say to people. You know what to say to me. You're different. Lady Danbury threw her head back and laughed. If ever there was an understatement. Oh, Penelope, I hope you don't mind if I call you by your given name. If you can speak your mind to me, you can speak it to anyone. Half the grown men in this room run cowering into corners the minute they see me coming. They just don't know you, Penelope said, patting her on the hand. And they don't know you, either, Lady Danbury quite pointedly replied. No, Penelope said, a touch of resignation in her voice, they don't. I'd say that it was their loss, but that would be rather cavalier of me, Lady Danbury said. Not to them, but to you, because as often as I call them all fools, and I do call them fools often, as I'm sure you know, some of them are actually rather decent people, and it's a crime they haven't gotten to know you. I wonder what is going on. Penelope found herself unaccountably sitting up a little straightened. She asked Lady Danbury, "What do you mean?" But it was clear that something was afoot. People were whispering and motioning to the small dais where the musicians were seated. "You there?" Lady Danbury said, poking her cane into the hip of a nearby gentleman. "What is going on?" "Cressida Twombly wants to make some sort of announcement," he said, then quickly stepped away, presumably to avoid any further conversation with Lady Danbury or her cane. "I hate Cressida Twombly," Penelope muttered. Lady Danbury choked on a bit of laughter. "And you say you don't know how to speak your mind? Don't keep me in suspense. Why do you detest her so?" Penelope shrugged. "She's always behaved quite badly toward me." Lady Danbury nodded knowingly. "All bullies have a favorite victim." "It's not so bad now," Penelope said. "But back when we were both out, when she was still Cressida Cooper, she never could resist the chance to torment me. And people, well." She shook her head. "Never mind." "No, please," Lady Danbury said, "do go on." Penelope sighed. "It's nothing, really. Just that I've noticed that people don't often rush to another's defense. Cressida was popular, at least with a certain set, and she was rather frightening to the other girls our age. No one dared go against her. Well, almost no one." That got Lady Danbury's attention, and she smiled. "Who was your champion, Penelope?" "Champions, actually," Penelope replied. "The Bridgertons always came to my aid. Anthony Bridgerton once gave her the cut direct and took me in to dinner, and," her voice rose with remembered excitement, "he really shouldn't have done so. It was a formal dinner party, and he was supposed to escort in some marchioness, I think." She sighed, treasuring the memory. "It was lovely. He's a good man, that Anthony Bridgerton." Penelope nodded. "His wife told me that that was the day she fell in love with him. When she saw him being my hero." Lady Danbury smiled. "And has the younger Mr. Bridgerton ever rushed to your aid?" "Colin, you mean?" Penelope didn't even wait for Lady Danbury's nod before adding, "Of course, although never with quite so much drama. But I must say, as nice as it is that the Bridgertons are so supportive." "What is it, Penelope?" Lady Danbury asked. Penelope sighed again. It seemed a night for sighs. "I just wish they didn't have to defend me so often. You'd think I could defend myself. Or at least comport myself in such a manner so that no defending was necessary." Lady Danbury patted her hand. "I think you get on a great deal better than you think you do. And as for that Cressida Twombly." Lady Danbury's face soured with distaste. "Well, she got her just desserts, if you ask me. Although," she added sharply, "people don't ask me as often as they should." Penelope could not quite suppress a little snort of laughter. "Look where she is now," Lady Danbury said sharply. "Widowed and without even a fortune to show for it. She married that old lecher Horace Twombly, and it turned out he'd managed to fool everyone into thinking he had money. Now she has nothing but fading good looks. Honesty compelled Penelope to say, she is still quite attractive." "Oomph. If you like flashy women." Lady Danbury's eyes narrowed. "There is something far too obvious about that woman." Penelope looked toward the dais, where Cressida was waiting, standing there with a surprising amount of patience while the ballroom quieted down. "I wonder what she is going to say." "Nothing that could possibly interest me," Lady Danbury retorted. Oh." She stopped, and her lips curved into the oddest of expressions, a little bit frown, a little bit smile. "What is it?" Penelope asked. She craned her neck to try to see Lady Danbury's line of vision, but a rather portly gentleman was blocking her way. "Your Mr. Bridgerton is approaching," Lady Danbury said, the smile edging out the frown. "And he looks quite determined." Penelope immediately twisted her head around. "For the love of God, girl, don't look." Lady Danbury exclaimed, jamming her elbow into Penelope's upper arm. He'll know you're interested. I don't think there's much of a chance he hasn't figured that out already, Penelope mumbled. And then there he was, standing splendidly in front of her, looking like some handsome god, deigning to grace earth with his presence. Lady Danbury, he said, executing a smooth and graceful bow. Miss Featherington. Mr. Bridgerton, Lady Danbury said, how nice to see you. Colin looked to Penelope. Mr. Bridgerton, she murmured, not knowing what else to say. What did one say to a man one had recently kissed? Penelope certainly had no experience in that area. Not to mention the added complication of his storming out of the house once they were through. I'd hoped. Colin began, then stopped and frowned, looking up toward the dais. What is everyone looking at? Cressida Twombly has some sort of announcement, Lady Danbury said. Colin's face slid into a vaguely annoyed frown. Can't imagine what she has to say that I'd want to listen to, he muttered. Penelope couldn't help but grin. Cressida Twombly was considered a leader in society, or at least she had been when she'd been young and unmarried, but the Bridgertons had never liked her, and somehow that had always made Penelope feel a little better. Just then a trumpet blared, and the room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to the Earl of Macclesfield, who was standing on the dais next to Cressida, looking vaguely uncomfortable with all the attention. Penelope smiled. She'd been told the Earl had once been a terrible rake, but now he was a rather scholarly sort, devoted to his family. He was still handsome enough to be a rake, though. Almost as handsome as Colin. But only almost. Penelope knew she was biased, but it was difficult to imagine any creature quite as magnetically good-looking as Colin when he was smiling. Good evening, the Earl said loudly. Good evening to you, came a drunken shout from the back of the room. The Earl gave a good-natured nod, a tolerant half-smile playing along his lips. My, esteemed guest here, he motioned to Cressida, would like to make an announcement. So if you would all give your attention to the lady beside me, I give you Lady Twombly. A low ripple of whispers spread across the room as Cressida stepped forward, nodding regally at the crowd. She waited for the room to fall into stark silence, and then she said, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for taking time out of your festivities to lend me your attention. Hurry up with it, someone shouted, probably the same person who had yelled good evening to the Earl. Cressida ignored the interruption. I have come to the conclusion that I can no longer continue the deception that has ruled my life for the last 11 years. The ballroom was rocked with the low buzz of whispers. Everyone knew what she was going to say, and yet no one could believe it was actually true. Therefore, Cressida continued, her voice growing in volume, I have decided to reveal my secret. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Lady Whistledown. Chapter 11. Colin couldn't remember the last time he'd entered a ballroom with quite so much apprehension. The last few days had not been among his best. He'd been in a bad mood, which had only been worsened by the fact that he was rather renowned for his good humor, which meant that everyone had felt compelled to comment on his foul disposition. There was nothing worse for a bad mood than being subjected to constant queries of, why are you in such a bad mood? His family had stopped asking after he'd actually snarled at Hyacinth when she'd asked him to accompany her to the theater the following week. Colin hadn't even been aware that he knew how to snarl. He was going to have to apologize to Hyacinth, which was going to be a chore, since Hyacinth never accepted apologies gracefully, at least not those that came from fellow Bridgertons. But Hyacinth was the least of his problems. Colin groaned. His sister wasn't the only person who deserved his apology. And that was why his heart was beating with this strange, nervous, and completely unprecedented rapidity as he entered the Macclesfield ballroom. Penelope would be here. He knew she'd be here because she always attended the major balls, even if she was now most often doing so as her sister's chaperone. There was something quite humbling in feeling nervous about seeing Penelope. Penelope was Penelope. It was almost as if she'd always been there, smiling politely at the perimeter of a ballroom. And he'd taken her for granted, in a way. Some things didn't change, and Penelope was one of them. Except she had changed. Colin didn't know when it had happened, or even if anyone other than himself had noticed it, but Penelope Featherington was not the same woman he used to know. Or maybe she was, and he had changed. Which made him feel even worse, because if that was the case, then Penelope had been interesting and lovely and kissable years ago, and he hadn't the maturity to notice. No, better to think that Penelope had changed. Colin had never been a great fan of self-flagellation. Whatever the case, he needed to make his apology, and he needed to do it soon. He had to apologize for the kiss, because she was a lady and he was, most of the time, at least, a gentleman. And he had to apologize for behaving like a raving idiot afterward, because it was simply the right thing to do. God only knew what Penelope thought he thought of her now. It wasn't difficult to find her once he entered the ballroom. He didn't bother to look among the dancing couples, which angered him. Why didn't the other men think to ask her to dance? Rather, he focused his attention along the walls, and sure enough, there she was, seated on a long bench next to, oh, God, Lady Danbury. Well, there was nothing else to do but walk right up. The way Penelope and the old busybody were clutching each other's hands, he couldn't expect Lady Danbury to disappear anytime soon. When he reached the pair of ladies, he turned first to Lady Danbury and swept into an elegant bow. Lady Danbury, he said, before turning his attention to Penelope. Miss Featherington. Mr. Bridgerton, Lady Danbury said, with a surprising lack of sharpness in her voice, how nice to see you. He nodded, then looked to Penelope, wondering what she was thinking, and whether he'd be able to see it in her eyes. But whatever she was thinking, or feeling, it was hidden under a rather thick layer of nervousness. Or maybe the nervousness was all she was feeling. He couldn't really blame her. The way he'd stormed out of her drawing room without an explanation, she had to feel confused. And it was his experience that confusion invariably led to apprehension. Mr. Bridgerton, she finally murmured, her entire bearing scrupulously polite. He cleared his throat. How to extract her from Lady Danbury's clutches? He'd really rather not humble himself in front of the nosy old countess. I'd hoped. He began, intending to say that he'd hoped to have a private word with Penelope. Lady Danbury would be ferociously curious, but there was really no other course of action, and it would probably do her good to be left in the dark for once. But just as his lips were forming his query, he realized that something strange was afoot in the Macclesfield ballroom. People were whispering and pointing toward the small orchestra, whose members had recently laid their instruments down. Furthermore, neither Penelope nor Lady Danbury were paying him the least attention. What is everyone looking at? Colin asked. Lady Danbury didn't even bother looking back at him as she replied, Cressida Twombly has some sort of announcement. How annoying. He'd never liked Cressida. She'd been mean and petty when she was Cressida Cooper, and she was meaner and pettier as Cressida Twombly. But she was beautiful, and she was intelligent, in a rather cruel sort of way, and so she was still considered a leader in certain society circles. Can't imagine what she has to say that I'd want to listen to, Colin muttered. He spied Penelope trying to stifle a smile and flashed her an I caught you sort of look. But it was the sort of I caught you look that also said and I agree completely. Good evening, came the loud voice of the Earl of Macclesfield. Good evening to you, replied some drunken fool in the back. Colin twisted to see who it was, but the crowd had grown too thick. The Earl spoke some more, then Cressida opened her mouth, at which point Colin ceased paying attention. Whatever Cressida had to say, it wasn't going to help him solve his main problem, figuring out exactly how he was going to apologize to Penelope. He'd tried rehearsing the words in his mind, but they never sounded quite right, and so he was hoping his famously glib tongue would lead him in the right direction when the time came. Surely she'd understand. Whistle down. Colin only caught the last word of Cressida's monologue, but there was no way he could have missed the massive collective indrawn breath that swept the ballroom. Followed by the flurry of harsh, urgent whispers one generally only hears after someone is caught in a very embarrassing, very public compromising position. What? He blurted out, turning to Penelope, who'd gone white as a sheet. What did she say? But Penelope was speechless. He looked to Lady Danbury, but the old lady had her hand over her mouth and looked as if she might possibly swoon. Which was somewhat alarming, as Colin would have bet large sums of money that Lady Danbury had never once swooned in all of her 70-odd years. What? He demanded again, hoping one of them would break free of her stupor. It can't be true, Lady Danbury finally whispered, her mouth slack even as she spoke the words. I don't believe it. What? She pointed toward Cressida, her extended index finger quivering in the flickering candlelight. That lady is not Lady Whistledown. Colin's head snapped back and forth. To Cressida. To Lady Danbury. To Cressida. To Penelope. She's Lady Whistledown, he finally blurted out. So she says, Lady Danbury replied, doubt written all over her face. Colin tended to agree with her. Cressida Twombly was the last person he'd have pegged as Lady Whistledown. She was smart, there was no denying that. But she wasn't clever, and she wasn't terribly witty unless she was poking fun at others. Lady Whistledown had a rather cutting sense of humor, but with the exception of her infamous comments on fashion, she never seemed to pick on the less popular members of society. When all was said and done, Colin had to say that Lady Whistledown had rather good taste in people. I can't believe this, Lady Danbury said with a loud snort of disgust. If I'd dreamed this would happen, I would never have made that beastly challenge. This is horrible, Penelope whispered. Her voice was quavering, and it made Colin uneasy. Are you all right? He asked. She shook her head. No, I don't think I am. I feel rather ill, actually. Do you want to leave? Penelope shook her head again. But I'll sit right here, if you don't mind. Of course, he said, keeping a concerned eye on her. She was still terribly pale. Oh, for the love of... Lady Danbury blasphemed, which took Colin by surprise, but then she actually swore, which he thought might very well have tilted the planet on its axis. Lady Danbury? He asked, gaping. She's coming this way, she muttered, jerking her head to the right. I should have known I'd not escape. Colin looked to his left. Cressida was trying to make her way through the crowd, presumably to confront Lady Danbury and collect her prize. She was, naturally, being accosted at every turn by fellow partygoers. She seemed to be reveling in the attention, no big surprise there. Cressida had always reveled in attention, but she also seemed rather determined to reach Lady Danbury's side. There's no way to avoid her, I'm afraid, Colin said to Lady Danbury. I know, she grumbled. I've been trying to avoid her for years, and I've never succeeded. I thought I was so clever. She looked to Colin, shaking her head with disgust. I thought it would be such fun to rout out Lady Whistledown. Well, it was fun, Colin said, not really meaning it. Lady Danbury jabbed him in the leg with her cane. It's not the least bit fun, you foolish boy, now look what I have to do. She waved the cane toward Cressida, who was drawing ever closer. I never dreamed I'd have to deal with the likes of her. Lady Danbury, Cressida said, swishing to a stop in front of her. How nice to see you. Lady Danbury had never been known for her pleasantries, but even she outdid herself by skipping any pretense of a greeting before snapping, I suppose you're here to try to collect your money. Cressida cocked her head to the side in a very pretty, very practiced manner. You did say you would give £1,000 to whomever unmasked Lady Whistledown. She shrugged, lifting her hands in the air and then twisting them gracefully until her palms were up in a gesture of false humility. You never stipulated that I couldn't unmask myself. Lady Danbury rose to her feet, narrowed her eyes, and said, I don't believe it's you. Colin liked to think that he was rather suave and unflappable, but even he gasped at that. Cressida's blue eyes blazed with fury, but she quickly regained control of her emotions and said, I would be shocked if you did not behave with a degree of skepticism, Lady Danbury. After all, it is not your way to be trusting and gentle. Lady Danbury smiled. Well, perhaps not a smile, but her lips did move. I shall take that as a compliment, she said, and allow you to tell me that you meant it as such. Colin watched the stalemate with interest, and with a growing sense of alarm, until Lady Danbury turned quite suddenly to Penelope, who had risen to her feet mere seconds after she had. "What do you think, Miss Featherington?" Lady Danbury asked. Penelope visibly started, her entire body jerking slightly as she stammered, "What? I beg your pardon, what do you think?" Lady Danbury persisted. "Is Lady Twombly Lady Whistledown?" I'm sure I don't know." "Oh, come, now, Miss Featherington." Lady Danbury planted her hands on her hips and looked at Penelope with an expression that bordered on exasperation. "Surely you have an opinion on the matter." Colin felt himself stepping forward. Lady Danbury had no right to speak to Penelope in such a manner. And furthermore, he didn't like the expression on Penelope's face. She looked trapped, like a fox in a hunt, her eyes darting to him with a panic he'd never seen there before. He'd seen Penelope uncomfortable, and he'd seen her pained, but he'd never seen her truly panicked. And then it occurred to him, she hated being the center of attention. She might poke fun at her status as a wallflower and a spinster, and she'd probably have liked a little more attention from society, but this kind of attention, with everyone staring at her and awaiting the merest word from her lips. She was miserable. "Miss Featherington," Colin said smoothly, moving to her side, "you look unwell. Would you like to leave?" "Yes," she said, but then something strange happened. She changed. He didn't know how else to describe it. She simply changed. Right there, in the Macclesfield ballroom, by his side, Penelope Featherington became someone else. Her spine stiffened, and he could swear the heat from her body increased, and she said, "No. No, I have something to say." Lady Danbury smiled. Penelope looked straight at the old countess and said, "I don't think she's Lady Whistledown. I think she's lying." Colin instinctively pulled Penelope a little closer to his side. Cressida looked as if she might go for her throat. "I've always liked Lady Whistledown," Penelope said, her chin rising until her bearing was almost regal. She looked to Cressida, and their eyes caught as she added, "And it would break my heart if she turned out to be someone like Lady Twombly." Colin took her hand and squeezed it. He couldn't help himself. "Well said, Miss Featherington," Lady Danbury exclaimed, clapping her hands together in delight. "That is exactly what I was thinking, but I couldn't find the words." She turned to Colin with a smile. "She's very clever, you know." "I know," he replied, a strange, new pride brimming within him. "Most people don't notice it," Lady Danbury said, twisting so that her words were directed to, and probably only heard by, Colin. "I know," he murmured, "but I do." He had to smile at Lady Danbury's behavior, which he was certain was chosen in part to annoy the devil out of Cressida, who did not like to be ignored. "I will not be insulted by that nothing." Cressida fumed. She turned to Penelope with a seething glare and hissed, "I demand an apology." Penelope just nodded slowly and said, "That is your prerogative." And then she said nothing more. Colin had to physically wipe the smile from his face. Cressida clearly wanted to say more, and perhaps commit an act of violence while she was at it, but she held back, presumably because it was obvious that Penelope was among friends. She had always been renowned for her poise, however, and thus Colin was not surprised when she composed herself, turned to Lady Danbury, and said, "What do you plan to do about the £1,000? Lady Danbury looked at her for the longest second Colin had ever endured, then she turned to him, dear God, the last thing he wanted to do was get involved in this disaster, and asked, "And what do you think, Mr. Bridgerton? Is our Lady Twombly telling the truth?" Colin gave her a practiced smile. "You must be mad if you think I'm going to offer an opinion." "You're a surprisingly wise man, Mr. Bridgerton," Lady Danbury said approvingly. He nodded modestly, then ruined the effect by saying, "I pride myself on it." But what the hell, it wasn't every day a man was called wise by Lady Danbury. Most of her adjectives, after all, were of the decidedly negative variety. Cressida didn't even bother to bat her eyelashes at him, as Colin had already reflected. She wasn't stupid, just mean, and after a dozen years out in society, she had to know that he didn't much like her and certainly wasn't about to fall prey to her charms. Instead, she looked squarely at Lady Danbury and kept her voice evenly modulated as she asked, "What shall we do now, my lady?" Lady Danbury's lips pursed together until she almost appeared mouthless, then she said, "I need proof." Cressida blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Proof." Lady Danbury's cane slammed against the floor with remarkable force. "Which letter of the word did you not understand?" "I'm not handing over a king's ransom without proof." £1,000 is hardly a king's ransom, Cressida said, her expression growing petulant. Lady Danbury's eyes narrowed. "Then why are you so keen to get it?" Cressida was silent for a moment, but there was a tightness in everything about her stance, her posture, the line of her jaw. Everyone knew that her husband had left her in bad financial straits, but this was the first time anyone had hinted as such to her face. "Get me proof," Lady Danbury said, "and I'll give you the money." "Are you saying," Cressida said, and even as he despised her, Colin was forced to admire her ability to keep her voice even, "that my word is not good enough?" "That's precisely what I'm saying," Lady Danbury barked. "Good God, girl, you don't get to be my age without being allowed to insult anyone you please." Colin thought he heard Penelope choking, but when he stole a glance at her, there she was at his side, avidly watching the exchange. Her brown eyes were huge and luminous in her face, and she'd regained most of the color she'd lost when Cressida had made her unexpected announcement. In fact, now Penelope looked positively intrigued by the goings-on. "Fine," Cressida said, her voice low and deadly. "I will bring you proof in a fortnight's time." "What sort of proof?" Colin asked, then mentally kicked himself. The last thing he wanted to do was embroil himself in this mess, but his curiosity had gotten the better of him. Cressida turned to him, her face remarkably placid considering the insult she'd just been dealt by Lady Danbury, before countless witnesses. "You shall know it when I deliver it," she told him archly. And then she held out her arm, waiting for one of her minions to take it and lead her away. Which was really quite amazing, because a young man, a besotted fool, from all appearances, materialized at her side as if she'd conjured him by the mere tilt of her arm. A moment later they were gone. "Well," Lady Danbury said, after everyone had stood in reflective, or maybe stunned, silence for nearly a minute. "That was unpleasant." "I've never liked her," Colin said, to no one in particular. A small crowd had gathered around them, so his words were heard by more than Penelope and Lady Danbury, but he didn't much care. "Colin." He turned to see Hyacinth skidding through the crowd, dragging along Felicity Featherington as she barreled to his side. "What did she say?" Hyacinth asked breathlessly. "We tried to get here sooner, but it's been such a crush." "She said exactly what you would have expected her to say," he replied. Hyacinth pulled a face. "Men are never good for gossip." "I want exact words." "It's very interesting," Penelope said suddenly. Something about the thoughtful tone of her voice demanded attention, and in seconds the entire crowd had quieted. "Speak up," Lady Danbury instructed. "We're all listening." Colin expected such a demand to make Penelope uncomfortable, but whatever silent infusion of confidence she'd experienced a few minutes earlier was still with her, because she stood straight and proud as she said, "Why would someone reveal herself as Lady Whistledown?" "For the money, of course," Hyacinth said. Penelope shook her head. "Yes, but you'd think that Lady Whistledown would be quite wealthy by now. We've all been paying for her paper for years." "By God, she's right!" Lady Danbury exclaimed. "Perhaps Cressida merely sought attention," Colin suggested. It wasn't such an unbelievable hypothesis. Cressida had spent the bulk of her adult life trying to place herself at the center of attention. "I'd thought of that," Penelope allowed, "but does she really want this sort of attention? Lady Whistledown has insulted quite a few people over the years." "No one who means anything to me," Colin joked. Then, when it became obvious that his companions required an explanation, he added, "Haven't you all noticed that Lady Whistledown only insults the people who need insulting?" Penelope cleared her throat delicately. "I have been referred to as an overripe citrus fruit." He waved off her concern. "Except for the bits about fashion, of course." Penelope must have decided not to pursue the matter any further, because all she did was give Colin a long, assessing stare before turning back to Lady Danbury and saying, "Lady Whistledown has no motive to reveal herself. Cressida obviously does." Lady Danbury beamed, then all at once her face scrunched into a frown. "I suppose I'll have to give her the fortnight to come up with her proof. Fair play and all that. I, for one, will be very interested to see what she comes up with," Hyacinth put in. She turned to Penelope and added, "I say, you're very clever, did you know that?" Penelope blushed modestly, then she turned to her sister and said, "We must be going, Felicity." "So soon?" Felicity asked, and to his horror, Colin realized that he'd mouthed the very same words. "Mother wanted us home early," Penelope said. Felicity looked truly perplexed. "She did?" "She did," Penelope said emphatically. "And besides that, I am not feeling well." Felicity nodded glumly. "I shall instruct a footman to see that our carriage is brought around." "No, you stay," Penelope said, placing a hand on her sister's arm. "I will see to it." "I will see to it," Colin announced. Really, what was the use of being a gentleman when ladies insisted upon doing things for themselves? And then, before he even realized what he was doing, he'd facilitated Penelope's departure, and she left the scene without his ever having apologized to her. He supposed he should have deemed the evening a failure for that reason alone, but in all truth, he couldn't quite bring himself to do so. After all, he'd spent the better part of 5 minutes holding her hand. Chapter 12. It wasn't until Colin woke up the following morning that he realized he still hadn't apologized to Penelope. Strictly speaking, it probably was no longer necessary that he do so, even though they'd barely spoken at the Macclesfield ball the night before. They seemed to have forged an unspoken truce. Still, Colin didn't think he'd feel comfortable in his own skin until he spoke the words, "I'm sorry." It was the right thing to do. He was a gentleman, after all. And besides, he rather fancied seeing her that morning. He'd gone to number 5 for breakfast with his family, but he wanted to head straight for home after seeing Penelope, so he hopped in his carriage for the trip to the Featherington home on Mount Street, even though the distance was short enough to make him feel utterly lazy for doing so. He smiled contentedly and lay back against the squabs, watching the lovely springtime scene roll by his window. It was one of those perfect sorts of days when everything simply felt right. The sun was shining, he felt remarkably energized, he'd had an excellent morning meal. Life really didn't get better than this. And he was going over to see Penelope. Colin chose not to analyze why he was so eager to see her. That was the sort of thing an unmarried man of 33 didn't generally care to think about. Instead, he simply enjoyed the day, the sun, the air, even the 3 neat townhouses he passed on Mount Street before spying Penelope's front door. There was nothing remotely different or original about any of them, but it was such a perfect morning that they seemed unusually charming butted up next to each other, tall and thin, and stately with their grey Portland stone. It was a wonderful day, warm and serene, sunny and tranquil. Except that just as he started to rise from his seat, a short flurry of movement across the street caught his eye. Penelope. She was standing on the corner of Mount and Penter Streets, the far corner, the one that would not be visible to anyone looking out a window in the Featherington home. And she was climbing into a hired hack. Interesting. Colin frowned, mentally smacking himself on the forehead. It wasn't interesting. What the hell was he thinking? It wasn't interesting at all. It might have been interesting, had she been, say, a man. Or it might have been interesting if the conveyance into which she'd just entered had been one from the Featherington Mews and not some scruffy hired hack. But no, this was Penelope, who was certainly not a man, and she was entering a carriage by herself, presumably heading to some completely unsuitable location, because if she were doing anything proper and normal, she'd be in a Featherington conveyance. Or better yet, with one of her sisters or a maid or anyone, just not, damn it, by herself. This wasn't interesting, it was idiotic. Fool woman, he muttered, hopping down from his carriage with every intention of dashing toward the hack, wrenching the door open, and dragging her out. But just as his right foot left the confines of his carriage, he was struck by the same madness that led him to wander the world. Curiosity. Several choice curses were grumbled under his breath, all of them self-directed. He couldn't help it. It was so unlike Penelope to be taking off by herself in a hired hack, he had to know where she was going. And so, instead of forcibly shaking some sense into her, he directed his driver to follow the hack, and they rolled north toward the busy thoroughfare of Oxford Street, where, Colin reflected, surely Penelope intended to do a bit of shopping. There could be any number of reasons she wasn't using the Featherington carriage. Perhaps it was damaged, or one of their horses had taken ill, or Penelope was buying someone a gift and wanted to keep it a secret. No, that wasn't right. Penelope would never embark on a shopping expedition by herself. She would take a maid, or one of her sisters, or even one of his sisters. To stroll along Oxford Street by herself was to invite gossip. A woman alone was practically an advertisement for the next Whistledown column. Or used to be, he supposed. It was hard to get used to a life without Whistledown. He hadn't realized how accustomed he'd been to seeing it at his breakfast table whenever he was in town. And speaking of Lady Whistledown, he was even more certain than ever that she was none other than his sister Eloise. He'd gone over to number 5 for breakfast with the express purpose of questioning her, only to be informed that she was still feeling poorly and would not be joining the family that morning. It had not escaped Colin's notice, however, that a rather hefty tray of food had been sent up to Eloise's room. Whatever ailed his sister, it had not affected her appetite. He hadn't made any mention of his suspicions at the breakfast table. Truly, he saw no reason to upset his mother, who would surely be horrified at the thought. It was difficult to believe, however, that Eloise, whose love of discussing scandal was eclipsed only by her thrill at discovering it, would miss the opportunity to gossip about Cressida Twombly's revelation of the night before. Unless Eloise was Lady Whistledown, in which case she'd be up in her room, plotting her next step. The pieces all fit. It would have been depressing if Colin hadn't felt so oddly thrilled at having found her out. After they rolled along for a few minutes, he poked his head outside to make sure his driver had not lost sight of Penelope's carriage. There she was, right in front of him, or at least he thought it was her. Most hired hacks looked the same, so he was going to have to trust and hope that he was following the right one. But as he looked out, he realized that they'd traveled much farther east than he would have anticipated. In fact, they were just now passing Soho Street, which meant they were nearly to Tottenham Court Road, which meant... Dear God, was Penelope taking the carriage to his house? Bedford Square was practically right around the corner. A delicious thrill shot up his spine, because he couldn't imagine what she was doing in this part of town if not to see him. Who else would a woman like Penelope know in Bloomsbury? He couldn't imagine that her mother allowed her to associate with people who actually worked for a living, and Colin's neighbors, though certainly well enough born, were not of the aristocracy and rarely even of the gentry. And they all plodded off to work each day, doctoring and lawyering, or... Colin frowned. Hard. They'd just rolled past Tottenham Court Road. What the devil was she doing this far east? He supposed her driver might not know his way around town very well and thought to take Bloomsbury Street up to Bedford Square, even though it was a bit out of the way, but... He heard something very strange and realized it was the sound of his teeth grinding together. They'd just passed Bloomsbury Street and were presently veering right onto High Holborn. Devil take it, they were nearly in the city. What in God's name was Penelope planning to do in the city? It was no place for a woman. Hell, he hardly ever went there himself. The world of the Ton was farther west, in the hallowed buildings of St. James's and Mayfair. Not here in the city, with its narrow, twisting, medieval roads, and rather dangerous proximity to the tenements of the East End. Colin's jaw dropped progressively lower as they rolled on, and on, and on, until he realized they were turning down Shoe Lane. He craned his head out the window. He'd only been here once before, at the age of 9, when his tutor had dragged him and Benedict off to show them where the Great Fire of London had started in 1666. Colin remembered feeling vaguely disappointed when he'd learned that the culprit was a mere baker who'd not dampened the ashes in his oven properly. A fire like that should have had arson or intrigue in its origin. A fire like that was nothing compared to the feelings coming to a boil in his chest. Penelope had better have a damned good reason for coming out here by herself. She shouldn't be going anywhere unaccompanied, much less the city. Then, just when Colin was convinced that Penelope was going to travel all the way to the Dover coast, the carriages crossed Fleet Street and ground to a halt. Colin held still, waiting to see what Penelope was up to, even though every fibre of his being was screaming to leap out of the carriage and tackle her right there on the pavement. Call it intuition, call it madness, but somehow he knew that if he accosted Penelope right away, he would never learn of her true purpose here near Fleet Street. Once she was far enough away so that he could alight unnoticed, he jumped down from the carriage and followed her south towards some church that looked decidedly like a wedding cake. For God's sake, Colin muttered, completely unaware of blasphemy or puns, now is not the time to find religion, Penelope. She disappeared into the church, and his legs ate up the pavement after her, slowing only when he reached the front door. He didn't want to surprise her too quickly. Not before he found out what exactly she was doing there. His earlier words notwithstanding, he did not for one moment think that Penelope had suddenly developed a desire to extend her church-going habits to midweek visits. He slipped quietly into the church, keeping his footsteps as soft as he could. Penelope was walking down the center aisle, her left hand tapping along each pew, almost as if she were counting. Colin frowned as she picked her pew, then scooted in until she was in the middle. She sat utterly still for a moment, then reached into her reticule and pulled out an envelope. Her head moved the teeniest bit to the left, then to the right, and Colin could easily picture her face, her dark eyes darting in either direction as she checked the room for other people. He was safe from her gaze at the back, so far in the shadows that he was practically pressed up against the wall. And besides, she seemed intent upon remaining still and quiet in her movements. She certainly hadn't moved her head far enough to see him behind her. Bibles and prayer books were tucked in little pockets on the backs of the pews, and Colin watched as Penelope surreptitiously slid the envelope behind one. Then she stood and edged her way out toward the center aisle. And that was when Colin made his move. Stepping out of the shadows, he strode purposefully toward her, taking grim satisfaction in the horror on her face when she saw him. Call, she gasped. That would be Colin, he drawled, grasping her arm just above the elbow. His touch was light, but his grip was firm, and there was no way she could think that she might make an escape. Smart girl that she was, she didn't even try. But smart girl that she was, she did attempt to play at innocence. Colin, she finally managed to get out. What a surprise? She gulped. Yes. I'm sure it is. Her eyes darted to the door, to the nave, everywhere, but to the pew where she'd hidden her envelope. I've never seen you here before. I've never been. Penelope's mouth moved several times before her next words emerged. It's quite appropriate, actually, that you'd be here, actually, because, do you know the story of St. Bride's? He raised one brow. Is that where we are? Penelope was clearly trying for a smile, but the result was more of the open-mouthed idiot sort of look. Normally this would have amused him, but he was still angry with her for taking off on her own, not giving a care to her safety and welfare. But most of all, he was furious that she had a secret. Not so much that she'd kept a secret. Secrets were meant to be kept, and he couldn't blame her for that. Irrational as it was, he absolutely could not tolerate the fact that she had a secret. She was Penelope. She was supposed to be an open book. He knew her. He'd always known her. And now it seemed he'd never known her. Yes, she finally replied, her voice squeaking on the word. It's one of Wren's churches, actually, you know, the ones he did after the Great Fire. They're all over the city, and actually it's my favorite. I do so love the steeple. Don't you think it looks like a wedding cake? She was babbling. It was never a good sign when someone babbled. It generally meant they were hiding something. It was already obvious that Penelope was making an attempt at concealment, but the uncharacteristic rapidity of her words told him that her secret was exceedingly large, indeed. He stared at her for a very long time, drawn out over many seconds just to torture her, then finally asked, "Is that why you think it's appropriate that I'm here?" Her face went blank. "The wedding cake," he prompted. "Oh," she squealed, her skin flushing a deep, guilty red. "No. Not at all. It's just that, what I meant to say was that this is the church for writers. And publishers. I think. About the publishers, that is." She was flailing, and she knew she was flailing. He could see it in her eyes, on her face, in the very way her hands twisted as she spoke. But she kept trying, kept attempting to keep up the pretense, and so he did nothing but give her a sardonic stare as she continued with, "But I'm sure about the writers." And then, with a flourish that might have been triumphant if she hadn't ruined it with a nervous swallow, "And you're a writer, so you're saying this is my church?" Air. Her eyes darted to her left. "Yes." "Excellent." She gulped. "It is?" "Oh, yes," he said, with a smooth casualness to his words that was intended to terrify her. Her eyes darted to her left again, toward the pew where she'd hidden her correspondence. She'd been so good until now, keeping her attention off of her incriminating evidence. He'd almost been proud of her for it. "My church," he repeated. "What a lovely notion." Her eyes grew round, scared. "I'm afraid I don't catch your meaning." He tapped his finger to his jaw, then held out his hand in a thoughtful manner. "I believe I'm developing a taste for prayer." "Prayer?" she echoed weakly. "You?" "Oh, yes. Well. I. Yes," he queried, beginning to enjoy this in a sick sort of way. He'd never been the angry, brooding type. Clearly, he hadn't known what he was missing. There was something rather pleasing in making her squirm. "Penelope," he continued. "Did you have something to say?" She swallowed. "No, good." He smiled blandly. "Then I believe I require a few moments for myself." "I'm sorry?" He stepped to his right. "I'm in a church. I believe I want to pray." She stepped to her left. "I beg your pardon?" He cocked his head very slightly to the side in question. "I said that I want to pray." It wasn't a terribly complicated sentiment. He could tell that she was straining hard not to rise to his bait. She was trying to smile, but her jaw was tense, and he'd wager that her teeth were going to grind themselves to powder within minutes. "I didn't think you were a particularly religious person," she said. "I'm not." He waited for her to react, then added, "I intend to pray for you." She swallowed uncontrollably. "Me?" she squeaked. "Because," he began, unable to prevent his voice from rising in volume, "by the time I'm done, prayer is the only thing that is going to save you." And with that he brushed her aside and strode to where she'd hidden the envelope. "Colin," she yelled, running frantically after him. "No." He yanked the envelope out from behind the prayer book, but didn't yet look at it. "Do you want to tell me what this is?" he demanded. "Before I look myself, do you want to tell me?" "No," she said, her voice breaking on the word. His heart breaking at the expression in her eyes. "Please," she begged him. "Please give it to me." And then, when he did nothing but stare at her with hard, angry eyes, she whispered, "It's mine." "It's a secret." "A secret worth your welfare?" he nearly roared. "Worth your life? What are you talking about? Do you have any idea how dangerous it is for a woman alone in the city? Alone anywhere?" All she said was, Colin, please. She reached for the envelope, still held out of her reach. And suddenly, he didn't know what he was doing. This wasn't him. This insane fury, this anger, it couldn't be his. And yet it was. But the troubling part was, it was Penelope who had made him thus. And what had she done? Traveled across London by herself? He was rather irritated at her for her lack of concern for her own safety, but that paled in comparison to the fury he felt at her keeping of secrets. His anger was entirely unwarranted. He had no right to expect that Penelope share her secrets with him. They had no commitments to each other, nothing beyond a rather nice friendship and a single, albeit disturbingly moving, kiss. He certainly wouldn't have shared his journals with her if she hadn't stumbled upon them herself. Colin, she whispered. Please, don't. She'd seen his secret writings. Why shouldn't he see hers? Did she have a lover? Was all that nonsense about never having been kissed exactly that, nonsense? Dear God, was this fire burning in his belly, jealousy? Colin, she said again, choking now. She placed her hand on his, trying to prevent him from opening the envelope. Not with strength, for she could never match him on that, just with her presence. But there was no way he could have stopped himself at that point. He would have died before surrendering that envelope to her unopened. He tore it open. Penelope let out a strangled cry and ran from the church. Colin read the words. And then he sank to the pew, bloodless, breathless. Oh, my God, he whispered. Oh, my God. By the time Penelope reached the outer steps to St. Bride's Church, she was hysterical. Or at least as hysterical as she'd ever been. Her breath was coming in short, sharp gasps, tears pricked her eyes, and her heart felt. Well, her heart felt as if it wanted to throw up, if such a thing were possible. How could he have done this? He'd followed her. Followed her? Why would Colin follow her? What would he have to gain? Why would he? She suddenly looked around. Oh, damn, she wailed, not caring if anyone heard her. The hack had left. She'd given specific instructions to the driver to wait for her, that she'd only be a minute, but he was nowhere in sight. Another transgression she could lay at Colin's door. He'd delayed her inside the church, and now the hack had left, and she was stuck here on the steps of St. Bride's Church, in the middle of the city of London, so far from her home in Mayfair that she might as well have been in France. People were staring at her, and any minute now she was sure to be accosted, because who had ever seen a gently bred lady alone in the city, much less one who was so clearly on the verge of a nervous attack? Why had she been so foolish as to think that he was the perfect man? She'd spent half her life worshipping someone who wasn't even real. Because the Colin she knew, no, the Colin she thought she'd known, clearly didn't exist. And whoever this man was, she wasn't even sure she liked him. The man she'd loved so faithfully over the years never would have behaved like this. He wouldn't have followed her. Oh, very well, he would have, but only to assure himself of her safety, but he wouldn't have been so cruel, and he certainly wouldn't have opened her private correspondence. She had read 2 pages of his journal, that was true, but they hadn't been in a sealed envelope. She sank onto the steps and sat down, the stone cool even through the fabric of her dress. There was little she could do now besides sit here and wait for Colin. Only a fool would take off on foot by herself so far from home. She supposed she could hail a hack on Fleet Street, but what if they were all occupied, and besides, was there really any point in running from Colin? He knew where she lived, and unless she decided to run to the Orkney Islands, she wasn't likely to escape a confrontation. She sighed. Colin would probably find her in the Orkneys, seasoned traveler that he was. And she didn't even want to go to the Orkneys. She choked back a sob. Now she wasn't even making sense. Why was she fixated on the Orkney Islands? And then there was Colin's voice behind her, clipped and so very cold. Get up, was all he said. She did, not because he'd ordered her to, or at least that was what she told herself, and not because she was afraid of him, but rather because she couldn't sit on the steps of St. Bride's forever, And even if she wanted nothing more than to hide herself from Colin for the next 6 months, at the moment he was her only safe means home. He jerked his head toward the street. Into the carriage she went, climbing up as she heard Colin give the driver her address and then instruct him to take the long way. Oh, God. They'd been moving a good 30 seconds before he handed her the single sheet of paper that had been folded into the envelope she'd left in the church. "I believe this is yours," he said. She gulped and looked down, not that she needed to. She already had the words memorized. She'd written and rewritten them so many times the previous night, she didn't think they'd ever escape her memory. "There is nothing I despise more than a gentleman who thinks it amusing to give a lady a condescending pat on the hand as he murmurs, 'It is a woman's prerogative to change her mind.' And indeed, because I feel one should always support one's words with one's actions, I endeavor to keep my opinions and decisions steadfast and true. Which is why, gentle reader, when I wrote my column of April 19th, I truly intended it to be my last. However, events entirely beyond my control, or indeed beyond my approval, force me to put my pen to paper one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, this author is not Lady Cressida Twombly. She is nothing more than a scheming impostor, and it would break my heart to see my years of hard work attributed to one such as her." Lady Whistledown's Society Papers, April 21, 1824. Penelope refolded the paper with great precision, using the time to try to compose herself and figure out what on earth she was supposed to say at a moment like that. Finally, she attempted a smile, didn't quite meet his eyes, and joked, "Did you guess?" He didn't say anything, so she was forced to look up. She immediately wished she hadn't. Colin looked completely unlike himself. The easy smile that always tugged at his lips, the good humor forever lurking in his eyes, they were all gone, replaced by harsh lines and cold, pure ice. The man she knew, the man she'd loved for so very long, she didn't know who he was anymore. "I'll take that as a no," she said shakily. "Do you know what I am trying to do right now?" he asked, his voice startling and loud against the rhythmic clip-clop of the horse's hooves. She opened her mouth to say no, but one look at his face told her he didn't desire an answer, so she held her tongue. "I am trying to decide what, precisely, I am most angry with you about," he said. "Because there are so many things, so very many things, that I am finding it extraordinarily difficult to focus upon just one." It was on the tip of Penelope's tongue to suggest something. Her deception was a likely place to start, but on second thought, now seemed an excellent time to hold her counsel. "First of all," he said, the terribly even tone of his voice suggesting that he was trying very hard to keep his temper in check, and this was, in and of itself, rather disturbing, as she hadn't been aware that Colin even possessed a temper. "I cannot believe you were stupid enough to venture into the city by yourself, and in a hired hack, no less." "I could hardly go by myself in one of our own carriages," Penelope blurted out before she remembered that she'd meant to remain silent. His head moved about an inch to the left. She didn't know what that meant, but she couldn't imagine it was good, especially since it almost seemed as if his neck were tightening as it twisted. "I beg your pardon," he asked, his voice still that awful blend of satin and steel. Well, now she had to answer, didn't she? It's nothing," she said, hoping the evasion would reduce his attention on the rest of her reply. "Just that I'm not allowed to go out by myself." "I am aware of that," he bit off. "There's a damned good reason for it, too." "So if I wanted to go out by myself," she continued, choosing to ignore the second part of his reply, "I couldn't very well use one of our carriages. None of our drivers would agree to take me here." "Your drivers," he snapped, "are clearly men of impeccable wisdom and sense." Penelope said nothing. "Do you have any idea what could have happened to you?" he demanded, his sharp mask of control beginning to crack. Very little, actually," she said, gulping on the sentence. "I've come here before, Anne." "What?" His hand closed over her upper arm with painful force. "What did you just say?" Repeating it seemed almost dangerous to her health, so Penelope just stared at him, hoping that maybe she could break through the wild anger in his eyes and find the man she knew and loved so dearly. It's only when I need to leave an urgent message for my publisher, she explained. I send a coded message, then he knows to pick up my note here. And speaking of which, Colin said roughly, snatching the folded paper back from her hands, what the hell is this? Penelope stared at him in confusion. I would have thought it was obvious. Yes, of course, your bloody lady whistle down. And you've probably been laughing at me for weeks as I insisted it was Eloise. His face twisted as he spoke, nearly breaking her heart. No, she cried out. No, Colin, never. I would never laugh at you. But his face told her clearly that he did not believe her. There was humiliation in his emerald eyes, something she'd never seen there, something she'd never expected to see. He was a Bridgerton. He was popular, confident, self-possessed. Nothing could embarrass him. No one could humiliate him. Except, apparently, her. I couldn't tell you, she whispered, desperately trying to make that awful look in his eyes go away. Surely you knew I couldn't tell you. He was silent for an agonizingly long moment, and then, as if she'd never spoken, never tried to explain herself, he lifted the incriminating sheet of paper into the air and shook it, completely disregarding her impassioned outcry. This is stupidity, he said. Have you lost your mind? I don't know what you mean. You had a perfectly good escape, just waiting for you. Cressida Twombly was willing to take the blame for you. And then suddenly his hands were on her shoulders, and he was holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Why couldn't you just let it die, Penelope? His voice was urgent, his eyes blazing. It was the most feeling she'd ever seen in him, and it broke her heart that it was directed toward her in anger. And in shame. I couldn't let her do it, she whispered. I couldn't let her be me.